Hello, you are listening to today's episode of Radio Free XP. I'm Jesse Alford, and along with my co-host Tony Hansmann,
Hello.
we are talking with Davis Frank.
Hi there.
Hi, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. Thrilled to be here.
All right, Tony, what do we want to talk with Davis
It's
about?
Davis's first time on the show, and everyone's neck piece is how in the world did you get into this whole XP universe? There was a moment where you were maybe not a believer in pairing, and there was a moment where you were, and we'd love to hear that journey.
Sure. So there's a sort of a preamble to my first pairing session, which is that, and I'll give you a link to this because there's video of me telling the story almost better than I could do it today, which is, which I gave at Gogoruko in, I think, 2011 or something like that, which is I got invited to go see Kent Beck do a Tech Talk book tour thing at Xerox Park. Wound up afterwards when they kicked us out of the building, going with him and a couple other people, one of my coworkers and another person, to the Nut House in downtown Palo Alto and continuing to talk for another 2.5, 3 hours. And I walked into that knowing zip about XP. Hadn't heard about it at all. Literally, my manager at the time said, "Hey, you like software processy things? You should probably go to this." Okay, so I went in like totally cold. And I walked out of there thinking, oh crap, I need to start this as soon as possible. Now, for the record, this would have been 2002, I think, sometime in 2002. I was working at Handspring/Palm at the time. And then I left Palm in 2006 and spent the summer of 2006 kind of like I'm doing now, not doing much and trying to figure out what was next, the balance of 2006. And I taught somebody suggested I play with Ruby on Rails because that was the new hot thing. And as most of us know, Rails has testing built in. So I like how I can teach myself Ruby, this new language. Web programming, which I'd done a little bit of, was awful before, doing Perl CGI stuff. Yeah. So that was better. Hey, I could learn about databases, and hey, testing's built in. This is great. So I spent that summer teaching myself Rails and a little bit of SQL and whatnot. And when it was time to look to get a real job, I said, I'm going to find myself an XP shop, because the few years of trying to do things like XP at Handspring and Palm did not go well. A lot of reluctance to everything. I think I got stand-up-y, like daily iteration kind of things in on a couple of teams, but that was about it. So I said, I'm going to find myself an XP shop doing Rails, and let's see what happens. And I landed at a Pivotal Labs client, known as Real Girls Media, working on an app called Divine Caroline. And my first real pairing session was the interview day. Now, they weren't doing RPIs, so I didn't do the RPI exercise, but I showed up for a morning session with one developer at the company and an afternoon session with the other developer at the company using Pivotal Tracker, really early days Pivotal Tracker. And as you might imagine, I was hooked by the end of that day. The first session was absolutely unproductive because they were in the transition, the sort of the weaning off that Pivotal Labs always did. You know, you hire more, especially with startups, right? You hire a bunch of developers and you wean the pivots off, and by the end, then people can run on their own. And so I was going to be the last one hired. So there weren't that many pivots around, but there was a lot of the app built that a lot of the client devs didn't know. So we spent most of the morning trying to figure out what the heck this story was about. And I think we both, we started with different levels of understanding of how the CMS that worked, but by the end of the session, we had probably maybe gotten 2 tests passing, hadn't completed a story. Like, oh, that was great. Went to lunch, and then came back. And the afternoon session was, we were running into some problems with MySQL, and I happened to have written, there was an old Rails wiki back in the days. I don't remember what the software was. It might have been a Rails app, but it was really awful, but it had some stuff on it. And I had written a page on that wiki about how to get, if you're developing on Windows, how to get MySQL under Cygwin running so you could do Rails development through Cygwin into MySQL. And I wrote a whole, like I had figured this out on my own, and not pairing, and had written this whole thing up and edited it with people over time. It's like, great, this community is interesting. So we were having problems, and I'd made a suggestion to the pair as we were working through the story. Hey, I've got this wiki page up that I worked on. Maybe that'll help us. And he's like, oh, okay. And so we went through that page, made like 2 small corrections, and got to the point where suddenly the MySQL bug was gone. But then we actually found out what the real problem was, and then we paired on getting that story finished. It was great. I'm like, oh wow! And like I walked out of the day going, yeah, okay, this is what Kent Beck was talking about at that point 5+ years ago. How can I have more, please? And that was, that was the beginning. That was my first, honest to God, what we would call legitimately XP based pairing session, and I pretty much have never looked back from that.
It's interesting to me how often that's the case, that it's like, oh, the first pairing session that I had, and it's not always. I know people who came to Pivotal because they'd experienced pairing and were like, oh, I want to go somewhere that does this. But a lot of the time, it's like, oh, I first experienced this during the interview.
Right.
And this is something that the Pivotal hiring process had an important impact in various ways on the Pivotal culture.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that it was the first legitimately like, wow, XP is possible experience is like what labs did for clients in microcosm.
Mm-hmm. And absolutely intentional, right? Because this is, there's actually been some good discussion, I guess yesterday, maybe the day before, on the Pivotal alum Slack about interview processes and whatever. And like in general, I think everyone there, among the things that we could agree on in discussion was, the closer that you can get to your actual workday, the better filter you've got for a person. And I think that's bi-directional, right? It's great for you as a company because you can actually like learn what this person, how this person works well in the real world, or as close, a closer facsimile of the real world, a simulacrum, if you will. And it's also great for you as a potential employee because you're like, oh, this is how they work. And if this is how they work, then I walked out of there with, even if it's a toy exercise or a really simple story or stories that you work on, more about what your day-to-day is going to be like. And yeah, I did that. I'm like, yeah, okay, this is what I want. Can I more, please?
And this is one of the things that we learned on Cloud Foundry. People would make the mistake of going through their backlog and trying to find a good coding story. And it's like, first of all, this person's been RPI.
Right.
They can read code. They can make a test pass.
Right.
They can spot a refactor. How much of your day do you spend doing those things, right? So I went the other way and started saying we need to make sure that we have a YAML story in here somewhere, right?
Ooh.
We need a rel end. We need a pipeline story in this interview, because if we are hiring people based on this experience that we're offering them of, oh, it's all these really nice TDD feature stories where you get to do in and write tests and make them pass, they are going to be dissatisfied with, the balance of work available on a product like Cloud Foundry. And that continued to be very valuable, but it's easy to say like, oh, this good experience that I had, because a lot of the people who were designing these interviews had your experience and were hired to work on more software development type things. And so they ended up unintentionally misrepresenting the workload of the actual product.
Sure.
So
it's also, it's hard to do that in a day, right? Or it's certainly hard to do that in one story, but it's fair enough to at least try to expose them to as much as you can so that you can set that expectation.
Yeah, the selection criteria for something that's going to be tractable and finishable and all that remain in place, but it's,
The other thing that's there's a, oh, sorry, Tony, did you want to add on?
To get this story out, there's these particular questions I love to ask, which is, hey, you showed up on that day, and let's just pretend that your entire programming effectiveness score is 1. We're going to call everything you showed up with on that first day 1.
Mm-hmm.
What was your score after 6 months?
See, I think after 6 months, because I'm still the client developer, right? And Pivotal, I think at that point, Pivotal was completely disengaged. A couple of people came back for like a 1 little 2-week thing, but I think that was after the 6 month. I think at 6 months, I started interviewing again. I don't think I've told this story to many people. And that was mostly because of conflicts with management. And so I think my scale was I'd certainly seen a whole lot of the product. So it was probably, definitely, if 10 is you've sort of touched all the product and know a lot of what's going on, I was probably at an 8 or 9. And I was definitely that thing that a lot of clients run into over time after they've left. The further away you get from a labs, like the median story, if you talk to people, right, is the further away you get from a labs engagement, the further away you are from like the influence, which means it's easy to fall into bad habits, right? Now, sometimes that's great. There'll be a lot of iteration, and plenty of stories of clients that have, hey, they got it and they iterated like crazy and gangbusters better. We weren't in that case. So I was probably at an 8 or a 9 and was pretty frustrated. Didn't find anything. And then that's when I started having lunch with Rob Me a little bit more often, and he finally said, "Why don't you just come here?" And we figured out how to make that happen. But it was sort of like 2 stints of about 6-ish months, 6 or 8 months.
Did I parse that correctly? That you were frustrated that you were only 8 or 9 times more effective than when you started?
No, that wasn't meant as a sorry, wrong scale. I was going how if 1 is the experience you had on the first day representative of working on the product, like at 6 months, I was answering like how well did you feel you knew the team and the code and how things worked there?
To me, that's a test of your a native skill. Really what I'm looking for is you are as good as you are in software when you walk in, and then you start pairing, and then how much better at software are you after you start pairing? Your own effectiveness.
Oh, okay. My own effectiveness. Okay. That's it. Okay. Okay. Way more than 8. I would say easily. What was the number in Dwayne's podcast throughout?
Dwayne is 20 plus. Yeah, he's just like, I was 20x more effective.
I think I was 20x more effective, but I will put a caveat on this, which is about the 5 years before I quit, my entire time at Palm, which was almost 5 years. I was not coding every day. I was mostly in a management or program management kind of a role. I did little things here and there, but nothing like for real. Like I was too busy facilitating and pushing things forward than I was coding every day. So I had this interesting 5-year gap where I went from being a C++/assembly Windows programmer to working on smartphones and nowhere near the code, though. Like I said, I did a little bit of scripting here and there. And then suddenly I'm now in a Ruby web world, like completely different context. What I found was super interesting to me was that I had not lost a lot of my object-oriented programming instincts. And I think Ruby, just to talk about Ruby for a sec, the expressiveness of Ruby was such that I could just like sort of think and type in English, and I got really close, which is among the reasons that Ruby makes us Rubyists happy. And what I thought was interesting was how much easier it was to express those things in Ruby versus C++. But what I will tell you is the reason that I think I was well over 10, maybe close to 20% more effective was because of the quick acquisition and reinforcement you get from pairing and testing. So I think it's super interesting to say, yeah, great. I'm at a startup. Fine. I'd done that before. I'm with a bunch of people I never met before. Great. Done that. But I'm doing this web tech thing that's different, and Ruby that's different. And testing. Yeah. Testing. Wow. That feels easy, but it was that constant reinforcement. You're like, oh, wow, this is great. Yeah, it turns out I do. These muscles are here. I've woken them back up. Let's use them. Syntax is different and the context is different. But it was super, super, like the coding became easy. The hard stuff was, the hard stuff, but like making code happen and validating and invalidating approaches to things, that made, easily close to 20x, I would say.
Let's ask the counterfactual. So was that 20x going to happen in any other arena?
Like, say you had code review instead of pairing.
Oh, wow. That's super interesting. Okay, I don't know. I doubt it, but it's weird, right? Because I was self-selecting. Like I probably would have gone, another couple of months without a job trying to find something like this to practice this.
Right.
So I can't speak that to myself. What I will say is that my most recent company where I was a director, so second level management and whatever, and I wasn't coding every day, I saw people move much more slowly when there wasn't a lot of pairing and not a lot of paying attention to the testing. So that's the closest I could get to like trying to validate the counterfactual there. I will also tell you that I am so freaking slow when it comes to doing my own coding stuff when I'm not pairing. That's the other. I think that's another piece of evidence. So no, I don't think I would be close to 20.
That's a whole type of pivot, and
right.
I'm in that type of pivot too. Like I'm very slow personally, and the other thing is I literally learned by pairing on the production floor on Cloud Foundry how to program. And so when I start up a little side project or whatever, I'm like, okay, empty commit, write a test to make sure it builds on a concourse server so that I can see my hello world is getting built automatically. Like I set up CI before I do my first feature. People are like, what are you doing? This is insane.
Right.
This is literally the only way I know how to do this. Like I can't do it without tiny tests and CI and small commits and, rapid iteration.
Sure.
I don't know how.
Right. Which is good and bad.
I'm a environment zealot, right? If you are if you're not set up to iterate, you're not set up to succeed. Like it's just that straightforward.
Yeah, that's totally hard.
As a reminder, you're listening to Radio Free XP with my host Tony Hansmann and our guest Davis Frank.
Hi there.
So freaks me out that we can't communicate what the magnitude of the value here. So I know that you are a person who, I don't know how many RPIs you must have delivered, and I don't know how many pivots you brought on board. But we don't get an opportunity to talk to someone who's so long-term, who has seen so much of this process. Like Jesse points out, it's the first time they've really paired. It's the interview. And then walk us all the way through. What do you coach people on? You get them, they're on your team or you're their manager. How do you coach them through the first, say, 4 weeks? Because my experience is there is some transition.
Oh, God, yes, there's transition. Oh, yeah, the transition is tough. So I think, so the most recent time when I'll go to PKS RelEng because that was an interesting team in that I showed up on that team in late 2019 where we were completely restaffing it. It had been a team, just for the history, the PKS team, which was the Pivotal Kubernetes distribution that ran inside of as a service as part of Pivotal Cloud Foundry. Everybody get your boxes and lines in your head going. That team was a joint team with VMware developers in Palo Alto and Pivotal developers in Ireland. And those teams were not working well together for all the reasons that Pivotal and VMware teams have had problems. And so one of our favorite humans, Elizabeth Hendrickson, decided with management that the thing to do would be to basically get the pivots into Palo Alto so that they were side by side with the VMware folks and move the pivots in Ireland onto other Cloud Foundry projects. So Elizabeth and I had, along with Todd Sedano and Phil, had to restaff that entire team here in the U.S. So that was fun. Hired a lot of new people. So that's my most recent experience, even though it's now 4 years ago. Getting people on and not like a couple of people is funny. Like one of the people we hired right before I joined, he'd been on the team for about 3 weeks. I sat down and he and I were doing our first pairing session. He looked at me funny and asked me a couple of questions. I asked him a couple of questions. he said, wait, you've been at Pivotal how long? And I told him, and I said, what's your background? He goes, oh, I was a thought worker. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, fine. And like all the pretense just dropped. And like Satinder and I, like, we had some of the best pairing sessions ever. In fact, we had to stop pairing together because we were too strong. Like we needed to spread the influence around some of the people who didn't have the experience. But we definitely hired a good handful of people that had zero pairing or zero. We did hire a couple of people that had been at Pivotal clients, so they were easy and they got it right away. Like there weren't a problem. But there was a handful, I would say 3 or 4 people who first pairing experience, really didn't know about it, whatever. And things I always tell people are, please, please, please turn your brain off at 6 o'clock. Just go, stand up, push back. It's okay. And sometimes you've got to do that at 4 in your first 2 or 3 weeks. That's totally fine. Expect to be tired. Expect to that. Well, I guess the analogy I always used in these situations is that it's a lot like any new physical activity you do. The martial arts, workouts, learning how to run, well, whatever it is, like your body knows how to do that thing, but you haven't done it for a sustained period of time, and almost continuously at a really, really high level. So it's okay to jog before you're running a 4-minute mile. It's totally fine. And to tell people it's okay to tap out, right? And what I think one of my favorite examples is there was somebody who did not like, I don't want to name for, maybe you don't want to name for this, but that sort of anti-pairing thing of like, I'm just going to code with you next to me and maybe I'm talking while I'm doing. There was one person that we had hired, they didn't last on the team long, who left, who was very much like that. So I remember one of the other people that we had hired about the same time, she was having a hard time with this other person. And then she and I sat down and it was our first day pairing together and trying to figure each other out and learn each other's, picadillos. And I explained, those of you who know me, for a long time when I was pairing, I had a size 0 soccer ball with me, so I wouldn't type. I've got all sorts of other fidget toys now. But that was the one that was yeah, right. Got the 3D printed thing. I've got the single edge Rubik's Cube here, like all sorts of things to play with my fingers. Keep my fingers moving away from the keyboard. But she was talking about how she didn't really like pairing and, this, that, and the other. And I said, well, actually, I really love it. Maybe let's what's worked and what's not worked for you. And I very quickly found out before lunch that it was this other person that had been sort of the bad actor and had really sort of soured her on it. And by the end of the day, it was great. We had deleted so much code that day, and we got something working that was way better. And she's like, wow, that was really nice. And yeah. I showed her some Ruby tricks, and she showed me some other parts of the code because she didn't. I came new that day. She had inherited the story from the previous day, and we cleaned all this stuff up. She was like, "Wow, that was really good. Okay, maybe this pairing thing isn't so bad after all."
And this is one of the few things that will get people corrected and then shape up or ship out, fired from a shop run by kindness, growth-oriented Pivotal managers. You cannot be creating bad pairing experiences for anyone on your team, but especially not juniors and underrepresented people.
Right.
If you are messing up the pairing experiences of any of our delicate, precious resources, we don't adopt a growth mindset around that.
No.
We adopt a change or leave mindset. Right. And it's one of the few things that we have that attitude towards.
Right. Gina Alei, if you know her, always talk about permission not to buy. Going back to that thing about interviewing that we talked about earlier, getting as close to the real thing. Still, you have to keep that permission not to buy in place at all times because stuff can change around you. Team composition could change, context could change, your parent company could change. And you've got to keep that mindset of like, hey, this is no longer working for me. But you're absolutely right about the inverse. Like, you got to be able to say, look, we're trying to do this thing. Here are the rails that you're in. And if you're not playing by that, we're not going to build people. We're not going to be able to have the ability to rotate people around and spread information around and whatever if they think pairing sucks.
Yeah.
When it turns out it just pairing with you sucks.
I have a whole chip on my shoulder about performance evaluation and all these other things.
Yeah.
But this is one place where I'm like, no, this is unambiguous. The responsibility of management to address or remove people who are ruining pairing experiences is not a performance issue. It's a great counterexample of a reason that you get rid of someone that is not performance or output related. It's about their effect on the team,
right?
And the qualitative call.
Right.
And it's a qualitative but fairly objective call, right? Because you have specific feedback from people who are having this experience, or often they're junior enough they don't know how to give that feedback.
Right.
So, I just
and I've seen that
in our conversation, but like every time one of these stories comes up, I'm like, yes, this is a thing that we did that was very important.
And I've seen it at both ends of the seniority spectrum, right? We had there was sort of a semi-written rule. I wouldn't say it's unwritten, a semi-written rule inside of labs that if the second time a client asked you to be removed from a team, you were pretty much walked out. Like that was it. They weren't walked out. Like it wasn't that extreme, but it was like, hey, this is not working. Which meant that the first time that happened, we did a lot in the management core to figure out, hey, why actually was I'll pick on myself. Why was Davis asked to be removed from that team by the client? Well, circumstance. Okay, is that an actual mark or not? Is it an opportunity to give some coaching, or is it just like, okay, this client is going to be out the door in a couple of weeks anyway, it doesn't matter. The flip side of that is I remember one or two cases of having very junior people who we were actively rotating around to try to find that magic pair that would unlock them. And we didn't always do it. Like we couldn't. And that, I think that there's one case that I can think about, which was very much this person did really well in the RPI, and on whatever day they interviewed, they did fine. They did fine enough, and they were a fresh grad. I will admit that. But rotating them around a couple of teams, we couldn't find that magic person to really unlock them, to get them even to 2 or 3. And so that was somebody that we sort of mutually decided to part company. But you've got to think about it at both sides, right? Because context is everything.
Let's do a quick station ID. It's Wednesday, October 25th. We're talking to Davis Frank. So Davis, you've left us with, that process of bringing people on board and it doesn't work. One of the things that's always interesting is how often didn't it work versus how often it did work.
I think it worked. I want to say, I don't know. I'm going to arbitrarily say I felt like it worked about 90% of the time. And that 10% that it didn't work was rarely immediate, that you realized that it didn't work. It was often 1 or 2 projects in that you said, oh yeah, you know what, we said yes because it felt right, but in going back to your one, how close is the first analysis of when I screwed up and said, like, how close did you feel like you knew the team, right? How well do you knew the person? If it was a 1, you never really got past a 2 or 3 with a person. That happened. Yeah, it didn't. I don't really feel like it happened a lot of the time, which was I think that I'm pretty happy with that 90%, and I would carry it forward. Actually, at my last company, we moved to an RPI. I actually trained somebody to RPI at my last company, and he's still doing it, which is great. And we standardized the second round. Couldn't get actual code. That's a story for another time. But we had a really good pairing session that was consistent, and a small number of people that gave it, and then a design session with a soft skills interview in the middle. And I think we wound up 2 or 3 people quit right after I joined and before we started this, and 1 person we fired. And I can think of 2 people that have been let go, maybe 3, once we instituted the new process. And 1 was just a permission not to buy. They're just like, yeah, it turns out this is not where I want to be. And there were a couple that just, we just never got them further up. So that ratio, I think, is fairly consistent, even if it wasn't completely what we did at Pivotal.
That's my experience. It did fail, but it failed so infrequently relative to everything else that it was completely amazing.
Yeah,
right.
And my question, I would not broadly categorize finding mismatches in the first few months as a failure of a hiring process. Like, you can set your goal as what your retain rate over what period is going to be, and then sure, you can fail relative to that. But relative to the baseline, I'm going to describe that as a success in terms of outcomes for being able to get that headcount open for someone who might be a better fit, and in terms of those people being able to go somewhere that's going to.
Yeah, sure. The earlier, the better, right? Like, that's independent. Like, that's completely independent of your process. The first week I was at Fountain, I was sort of acting VP for a day. Because our VP of engineering was out, and somebody failed for a remote first company. It's kind of funny to say this, but they failed to show up for their first day of work. And they said, "Yeah, no, I'm not going to show up." And they're like, "Okay, that's fine. Please send the laptop back, and send the PDF with the label or whatever." And of course, they never sent the laptop back. So our IT person was like, "Oh my gosh, that was a $3,500 laptop. Is that there?" I'm like, "That is the best $3,500 we have spent," because that person was no doubt going to flake at some point. So yeah, early failures, love them. Let's fail early and let's figure out why.
So I have a question that, Tony's gone through kind of his standard set of things that he likes to get out of people's pairing journeys. There's a collection of pairing journeys we're getting here.
Yeah.
People who have spent a long time pairing often have another type of experience where, pairing is actually pair programming as an XP practice. But then we talk about pairing and we just let that programming part, it may or may not apply. We start pairing on everything. So I'm wondering if you've had some interesting experiences in non-programming roles where you've used pairing successfully.
You're not ready for this. Are you ready for this?
There will be a follow-up about times that it failed disastrously.
Okay.
The times that it worked well.
Okay, so while I tell the success story, let's hope that my background process can find a really good failure. So where I'm standing right now is a rebuilt house in Burlingame, California, where I live. We did that thing. We tore our house down and rebuilt it. Gained a little square footage, gained a home office, which turns out moved back in 2018. We were prescient like you wouldn't believe. Now, so what's interesting, right, is as I mentioned at the top, if it didn't get edited out, my wife is a pivot. While educated as a software engineer, and we met as software engineers, she went to the dark side and got an MBA and became a product manager. And for a variety of funny reasons. One of which I always joke is in order to save our marriage, because I was tired of coaching her through her poorly performing engineering teams or frustratingly performing engineering teams as a VP of product. And not enough of my suggestions were helping. And when her company disappeared, brought her in, and she's still there, right? 8 years later, we paired on designing this house together. And sorry, design's not the fair word. We paired on being the client, in that we did the whole thing. We actually had all of our outcomes, and we had user stories in Tracker that we used to validate all of the designs that came from our firm, the design firm that we worked with. So that felt very pivotally, and we paired on going through, we paired on generating the stories and prioritizing them. We paired on accepting them on the designs, and in general, accepting them as things got built. It was a little harder because, atoms are a little bit harder than bits. But the thing that was best for us, and our firm said that this was we were atypical, was we were driving from here to 875 Howard in downtown San Francisco every day to get. Oh, sorry, there goes a thumb.
Use the video at this point.
Yeah, so I understand. If that doesn't get edited out, I apologize. We're accidentally playing with the operating system. So we were commuting together every day, which meant there were many days that we sat on 101 in dead traffic, like going through the questions that we had gotten over email from and going through the decisions that we had to make. That we had a couple of different inputs that we had to deal with. And so we often would ask ourselves a bunch of questions on the way in the morning, think about them in the back of our brains during the day, and then like resolve those by the time we got home. Those 2:45, 40-ish minute commutes. And our builder said, "Hey, you guys actually get back to us with answers really quickly. Like all the delays, none of the delays on this project, because it's Atom, so there were delays, were a result of us not being able to come to a decision." And that includes not believing that we couldn't fit on our island sink both the faucet and the filtered water thing. They told us there's no way these would fit. We came over to the construction site and spent about 2 hours with templates and sketching and whatever, taking pictures and whatever. And we said, no, they will fit. This is the right distance. And when everything put together, they're like, "Oh, you guys actually know what you're doing." We're like, yeah, sorry. So that was like absolutely paired on this house, and it was great. And great success. And we were astounded every day that we worked really well like that together. Disastrous pairing.
And it doesn't have to be totally disastrous, though. Obviously, the greater the catastrophe, the better the story. But I've had some experiences where I tried pairing something, and it's like never mind. Let's approach this a different way.
Yeah,
those are good too.
Oh, I wonder what's a really good one for that. Oh, okay. I'm going to pick another house one. Can I pick another house one?
You're allowed. I'll allow it.
Okay. So this has nothing to do with Christina. This is all about working with our interior designer. I had an idea for a design of the backsplash for behind our oven and our range and cooktop. That is a puzzle that you get to solve when you come to my house. So I won't tell you about it because that's an exercise left for the real world. But I tried to sit down with the designer and explain to him kind of what I wanted, and hey, let's work on this together to try to design this out. And he could not work with another person. Like he wanted to hear like constraints and go off and come up with 15 designs and show me two, right? And I'm like, let's work on this together. This will be fun. Like why not? And we worked together really well in many other ways on this journey. But I basically sketched out, something. I said, I'll tell you what, let me go draw a picture and we'll come back next week. And I showed him a picture of something like roughly, and it wasn't very elegant. I was hoping that as a designer, he would come up with something more elegant. He's like, no, we can totally do that with tile. And I'm like, oh, all right. Well, I guess that's the answer. And I got the outcome I wanted.
Sure.
And he did come back with some variations later that were in material and thing that made it work. But that was one where I'm like, oh, this isn't going to go well. I'm really surprised. So I had to back off on that. Is that close enough?
Yeah, no, that's close enough. That works for me. This is a good moment for a station identification. This is Radio Free XP. I'm Jesse Alford. My co-host today, Tony Hansmann, and I are talking with Davis Frank. I have another question about pairing, actually. So in your stories about pairing, I'm not hearing any of the formal language I sometimes use around pairing styles, like strong style or soft style or ping pong pairing. First of all, do you recognize each of those and are feel confident that you and I mean the same thing if we were to use any of the words?
I think so. Definitely for ping pong. Strong, I'm sure there's a spectrum there, but I bet I'm in the ballpark.
Yeah. Okay. So I am curious how I have always found, we'll go one assertion at a time. I have found that pivots generally end up defaulting to what I call soft style pairing, which
Okay.
is not strong style. It's not ping pong. It's not deliberate driver navigator handoff, but it is a little bit like, okay, don't hug the keyboard. Just sort of negotiate it loosely as you go. People hold things in their hands to avoid jumping in. It's fine if someone talks and types at the same time, because we have other ways of keeping it from being degenerate. Would you agree that that's kind of the pivotal house style of pairing, or do you think that I'm curious about this. There might be regions where no, it's like, no, ping pong is the default or similar.
I'm going to answer this maybe a little differently than you expect.
Go for it.
So I'm gonna invoke Rob here and talk. Rob always says that any two pairs, given two random pairs of developers, there are each pair is a different organism.
Mm-hmm.
So we have three different potential pairing organisms in this call right now, right? And what Jesse, you and I are optimal, our sort of day-to-day pairing style after we've worked together a little bit is going to be different than what you and Tony do or what Tony and I do.
Sure.
So I think what and this is somewhat informed by being a labs pivot for so long, and working on 3 or 4 client projects a year, which meant, you were pairing with, I don't know, 24 people, maybe 36 people a year, depending. Is that I think it's valuable to start with the default of something very strong, very ping-pongy, and let it flow and figure out where you go. And I think what you're observing is, I think when you're around it all day, every day, and you are pairing every day and are rotating very frequently, because I know CF was pretty good about that, at least within teams, that you sort of trend to your optimal style personally. And because we were all in screen for such high empaths, that we then would find the right complementary vibe for that a person, which I think would wind up over 2 or 3 years to be a very soft style like you're describing. But I bet that the 3 pairs in this call would define that super differently.
Well, and it's not just 3 pairs, because 1, we each contain multitudes, but 2,
sure,
the work we're doing is a really important note in that would call for a different style.
Right.
I asked the question not because I do not mean, when you take strong style as this defined set of rules, and I take it as separate from ping pong. Strong style, there's a driver and there's a navigator.
Yeah.
No idea should make it straight from one person onto the screen. It should always pass through the other person.
Okay.
So if you have an idea, you say, you take the keyboard so that I can tell you about my idea. Whereas ping pong is still very structured. It's a structured style, but it's often a little looser. But, just so that people who are listening who might not have heard these terms know what I'm talking about. Ping pong is, I write a test, you make it pass, you write a test, I make it pass, back and forth. You don't have to rigidly step within that. You might notice that refactors are missing within there, and like either person might come up with those. Those aren't part of the structure, but they are of course allowed. But that's ping pong.
Sure.
Strong style pairing is a gateway to mobbing, because you can set a timer and switch off every 15 minutes and start rotating through people. You got your driver, your navigator, and your back seat, right?
Yep.
And people are stepping through those. And then this soft style, that I don't mean in any way to be a pejorative, I chose that name because if you start with strong style and you call the other thing weak style, you've made a bad mistake, right?
Interesting.
Soft style is I think for a lot of people the most fluent and the most optimal, and I think it is the pivotal house style, and it tends to be what people evolve towards for all those reasons. And I am sometimes suspicious of it as a long-term, like I think it sometimes needs jostling on teams, that even if they have rotation, if their pool is fairly set, you end up with people who are maybe a little less optimal and a little less thoughtful about their pairing and their technique, than we might ideally see. And I suspect that this is a distinction. I think this is a problem more in a R&D organization than in a consulting organization, because clients keep you sharp, right? They create demand for need to constantly attend to the practices in a way where if everyone's on board, I think you can have a little bit of a slip in the diligence of people's XP practices. And, it's interesting to offset that. But I agree with your general assessment about like how and why the way that pivots tend to approach pairing is the way it is. And it sounds like what you've seen is very much like what I've seen in terms of how people approach it and what they tend to settle on.
Yeah, I think so. I was on Cloud Foundry for 6-ish months, I want to say, before I went to PKS, sort of going back in time, and it felt so easy. Like the transition for me was not hard. And I think that was because I think there were two reasons there. I think one was, though there'd been a gap between coding every day again. So there's a cycle in most of our careers, right? Many cycles. I did sort of approach it as like, I'm not going to just be me. I'm going to like go with the flow here and figure out what's going on. But I've got these techniques as having been for being a consultant for so long. I'm going to pull those tools out of my toolbox to figure out how the team I'm on works. So I definitely did that. But then, there were so many people on the team I was on and the teams that we bounced off of that had sort of evolved to what we're talking about, that it just felt like, I don't know, after the second week, I was complaining about code again instead of trying to figure out how things, how the teams worked. So it felt pretty familiar and straightforward. But yeah, I think like anything, right? As you develop that expertise, it just becomes very natural. Which gets back to the thing you were just talking about earlier about how you're really a slow developer on your own, right? Because it's like you just know how to work that way.
Well, and it's funny. This whole conversation is taking place against a backdrop of pairing as the default and a bunch of fluent pairs all around you and like rotation and so on.
Right.
And I don't think our audience probably experiences that. So
no,
let's
probably not.
Some of the pieces. Tony, you have a...
Yep. So Davis, you talked earlier about people who it doesn't work for, but we want to make this whole process legible to a listener who's never had these experiences. And so how did you actually bring people into pairing?
Sure. So let me answer that slightly differently and say like, hey, what is pairing like, right? Or maybe, sorry, that's not fair. To answer your question, I think let's talk about analogies, right? And this is actually something maybe from my pairing journey. I put it in my notes that I wanted to make sure we talked about, but I realized I glossed right over it, which was there was a certain familiarity that first interview day when I was pairing that I mentioned earlier, which is, and I'm old, I think I'm the oldest one in this call, but I'm old enough to know, to have been a teenager when all the Infocom text adventure games were gargantuan huge. They were like the number one, like that's what everybody was playing, because it was before the console wars began, and it was the way that those were the best games. And being a nerd in the 80s at home, not getting invited to the crazy parties on the weekends, my buddies and I, and there were 3 or 4 of us that did this together. We would get together, somebody would sleep over and we would literally stay up till 3 a.m. playing Infocom games. So this is 1984, 1983, 1986. USB doesn't exist. So having multiple keyboards at a time isn't going to happen. And multiple monitors, what are you talking about? Monitors are ridiculously expensive. Even the green screen CRTs, right? So literally in my parents' basement, with my friend Matt and his cousin Alec on occasion, and we would be trying to beat text adventure games. That is the closest to pair programming that outside of actually like writing code that I think that you can do. And so it was really familiar to me once it didn't, it's funny, it didn't come to me during that interview day. It didn't come to me in the abstract. It came to me several months in that first job of like, holy crap, I'm playing Deadline again. I'm playing Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy again. I'm playing A Mind Forever Voyaging, and we're arguing. No, I've got this great idea. Give me the keyboard. Or no, I can't. I'm falling asleep. I need to type because I can't figure it out. Right, what we're doing. Right, and maybe somebody was mapping. That was a good thing. Like get the graph paper out, or just steal the pin feed paper from the printer. And map the game. So that felt a lot like pairing to me. In completely in retrospect, looking back 30 years.
That triggers something for me where I would play an early 3D video game called Descent that was about flying.
Oh, I remember Descent.
Yep, through a mine shaft. Yeah. And me and my friends were, I don't know, we couldn't have been 7 or 8. And one of us would control weapons, like weapon selection.
Oh, nice.
And the other one was doing piloting. And this was really efficient for ammo conservation because you actually shoot a lot too much if you're also trying to fly. And, having someone be like, no, this is the moment to shoot. No, it was a ridiculous way to play the game. I don't know how he managed it. Like, I've not managed to have fun trying to recreate that arrangement. But just like, 2 office chairs at a desk on my friend's dad's work PC in their den.
Yep.
Like hands sort of like just trying to find a way to be on this extended keyboard together, making it happen.
Right.
And I heard my friends like my high school girlfriends, her and her 2 girlfriends would get together and play Doom this way with like a person driving and a person on the gun. So I think that there's a fair amount of
that's interesting. That's great.
Insane thing that people did when computers were a rare resource and a thing that you would like go over to each other's house to do.
Right. And it turns out it's just a really effective way to solve problems, right? It doesn't matter whether you're in a mine shaft or not. And then, yeah, Tony, if you're going to bring up Pacific Rim, right? Like, come on, how many jokes did we make when Pacific Rim came out about the drift, right? Like,
Pacific Rim is like the official, unofficial movie of.
Yeah, exactly.
If you take Pacific Rim and you marry it to the Edge of Tomorrow, you have a paired high iteration model all wrapped up by Hollywood.
Well, there you go. You have one okay movie and one fantastic movie there, right? But yes, I'm with you. We're gonna turn this into a Colin Deep movie podcast right now. No, no, absolutely, like, totally. That's it's we have this problem. We're gonna throw 2 brains at it, and let's figure out how to make it work. And whether it was the 80s or the 90s, you're talking about right, and the limited resource. How can we do this? And it just turned out we just made that easy.
Right. And the adventure style games, the first person control stuff is kind of a weird emergent thing, but it happened again with Myst and with all the like Monkey Island point and click adventure games where you would have the driver navigator collaborating at the computer pattern. And it still happens today. Double Fine Adventure. What did they actually call it? Broken Age. There's like a console point and click adventure game that you can put up in the home theater and just like sit there and try and puzzle out together. Oh, click that.
Right.
Go over there. I think we need to try something else. Are there any unexplored areas? Just naturally people fall into.
Right. So there's something there. So I would say if you're trying to come in and any of these ideas, any of these game things pop up and are intriguing to you, it turns out you can do that. You can do that with programming. I think super well. Like it translates well. And then I think an interesting thing to experiment with is I think there's an overlap with if you take this like one step further slightly in a certain direction, collaborative board games. There's a lot of overlap, I think, between collaborative board games and working as a balanced team.
Especially if you're aware of the problem those can have where you're playing for someone else.
Right.
That thing of like, hey, you're trying to learn to stay in your lane and be helpful here.
My kids will not play. Our kids will not play Pandemic with us anymore because Christina and I try to out PM the whole damn thing. And we scarred our children whenever pandemic came out 7 or 8 years ago. Maybe now that they're older, we'll get them back into a game again. But I would say that if that works well for you, or if that's compelling, or if you enjoy that collaborative, like even something simple like Forbidden Island, which is a great game to play with balanced teams. That's it. It's mobbing, it's pairing, it's balanced teaming. It's a great way to practice those muscles. And if you enjoy that, and it turns out you're intrigued by the idea that you could do that at work also, or on a software project if it's not directly for work, I would say that there's a gateway. That's the gateway for you. If you haven't done those things, or if you have and like, oh, I love that, why wouldn't I try pairing? It's like, well, okay, there you go.
All right. For anyone who happens to have broken out their pad and paper and started writing down the titles of things that they might try, let's just list a few others and then we'll roll on to the next session.
Okay.
There's Lovers in a Dangerous Space-Time, where you all are in a ship together and move between different stations. This is a PlayStation and some other things game. There's Overcooked.
Oh my God.
Which is up to 4 people trying to solve kitchens together.
Oh my God.
These things.
Overcooked saved our family in COVID.
Amazing.
Like, dude, I'm surprised that I think the only reasons that neighbors didn't call the cops on us was because of COVID. The amount of noise that the 4 of us made playing that game. We've spent a lot of money on that. Love Overcooked.
I've also found out that this is a great way to identify developers that you do not want to work with, because I played it with Pivots, and it's like this, you figure it out, You iterate, like you don't accuse each other of things. You're just like, okay, maybe someone else should do that station or whatever. And then you deal with someone else and they'll like get frustrated and start red teaming without even it crossing their mind that they're ruining other people's fun. It's like, okay, wow, this is what you're like to work with, huh?
Yep.
Incidentally, if someone's starting to get Overcooked now, you can get it on the Switch or PlayStation 2, or what are we up to now? 5? PlayStation 5. And they have like an Ultimate Edition that if you like the game at all, you should just buy that immediately, because it has all kinds of...
I think we bought Overcooked 1, and we then bought the Overcooked Edition, the Ultimate Edition, in order to get 2 and all the holiday stuff.
Yeah. Well, and 2 has network play, right? These are all great couch co-op, but you can actually play 2 over the internet.
Really? I did not know that. Oh, no.
You have to, you're like, oh, I understand the server model they've implemented here, but all right, let's wrap it up. Tony's like, okay, enough Overcooked, gentlemen.
Well, this is a great way to wind up. Pairing is, Jesse, I never noticed how we dropped programming. No one at Pivotal says pair programming. They just say pairing. And as soon as you get the gestalt of it, you demand pairing everywhere in your life, right? And so I think this is a great...
We were talking with Kobe yesterday, and he was like, that's one of the standard responses. He working as a designer early on in Pivotal, his experience with Pivotal, he would go up to someone and say, hey, I want to work on this, and they just like motion to the seat next to them. It's like, sit down, let's pair, right? This just becomes the standard way you deal with demands for assistance or attention or anything.
Yeah. So we're going to call your pairing journey done. Thanks for rolling that off. We'll do
done for now.
Yeah. Well,
I still want to pair in the future.
We could do whole shows on literally any element of pairing you want. Just say what they are, and we'll be back on.
Yeah.
But let's do a quick station ID. This is Radio Free XP. We're talking with Davis Frank. The big topic, Jesse, you want to roll into our topic of the day?
Well, yeah. So we happen to be recording the day after a number of people still at VMware have gotten or not gotten their offer letters with various terms and conditions attached due to the Broadcom acquisition at VMware. And as soon as I started hearing from people who are still there about what they were getting and experiencing and thinking, I jumped on pivotal.fun and encouraged people to seriously consider that this might be their opportunity to get out here and do something else. And I started telling Tony, we've got to do something about this. Like we've got to put something out for people who are considering this in this situation and trying to decide what to do. Because my fear is that there are a lot of people at Broadcom who have been thinking about this primarily in terms of not losing a paycheck or not losing employment and hoping they get an offer. And as soon as they get that offer, there's more time to decide than we were given when VMware did this. There's severance of people available if people decline the offer. Again, much better terms than we were offered at VMware.
Severance available, and there are people who got stock grants in June that will accelerate if they quit.
Amazing. I didn't even know that. So, there's the standard set of gripes about the difficulty of communication during an acquisition and, coordinating offer letters with thousands of people and so on. But I'm actually kind of impressed with how Broadcom has been handling this. And it's important to me to put a front matter up here that's like, if you're in a place where you're happy and in for the ride, I remember being there. I stayed at VMware for a long time for my own personal reasons. And I wouldn't want to say that anyone is crazy or wrong for making the decision to stay at Broadcom. And that severance and the world that is out here of other things that people could be doing, and the technologies and organizations that represent the opportunity cost that staying at Broadcom is spending. You're spending this opportunity cost to find out and to take Broadcom's offer. I want to have a conversation about what it's like to have left Pivotal, and just basically a show for those people. It might have a few different topics, but we're an interesting group of people. We all were really attached to what Pivotal was, and I think that well, okay, are really attached to what Pivotal was. And all of us have moved on to some degree or another from what Pivotal or PKS or PWS or PAS, any of the P acronyms that we worked on, are today, right? We've had our, it's complicated. Exactly. So that said, I found the experience of leaving was an enormous relief to a degree I didn't even anticipate. And I walked away from vesting and retention bonus offers and this upcoming acquisition that was only a few months away that I expected to come with additional severance and treasure of various types. And it was still undoubtedly a huge relief for me.
Was this the first time that you quit a job?
Oh my God. All right. I guess we have to talk about this. Was it the first time that I had quit a job? Yeah, I think so. But it's even more serious than that.
Okay.
Like, it's even more, I guess I did leave a job to take another job once before in my life. It's not like, every job I've had has ended with involuntary separation.
Sure.
But this was my entire tech career.
Got it.
I worked on Cloud Foundry for 10 years. And before that, I was not a software developer. So, yes. And this colors my experience, right? I spent 10 years telling people, stop trying to explain Go and memory management, Go's memory management. Stop trying to tell me when it's allocating to the stack and when it's allocating to the heap. We're making a CLI for merging YAML here. It's anti-useful as part of this pairing. And I believe that, right? I was in no way, the minute I set down the baton of being a tech lead for this specific thing, like 1 week after resigning, I was deep in the details and history of C# garbage collection and Rust's like memory congruent type system, because suddenly all these things that had been, I would describe myself as highly allocatable. I had been highly allocated to the things that I was allocated to.
Mm-hmm.
And all these other interests that had been waiting to be important to me suddenly were LLMs, new programming languages, iOS development, whole domains that are really interesting, really potentially rewarding, that I didn't even think of when I was thinking of leaving. I wasn't like, these are the things I'm going to get into. It's just that being at an organization that you're attached to in this way, I couldn't think of anything else except for ways that I might keep working on Cloud Foundry or save Concourse or contribute to No. So like having that experience, I wanted to get it out there, and I wanted to open the opportunity to talk about other possible experiences, because I think this is a great offer that Broadcom is offering people. And it is a weird market out there, and we can talk about some of what we've seen around that. But yeah, I think people should leave. I think they should seriously consider it. And if they're supposed to stay, they won't listen to me, right? I'm not afraid of influencing someone.
No. I think it's right. Everybody's context is different. Every situation is different. I know an interesting sprinkle of people that, I haven't heard from anybody yet. I know people that have gotten transition offers. I don't know anybody. I know keeps in transitions. I don't know anybody in the third group that said that your end date is like, at acquisition. I don't know anybody in the third.
No, the people who are in that category may not have received their letters yet.
I think that's
some no offers that have not received the confirmation.
Interesting. Yeah.
Laid off.
Right. I haven't. I know of some people outside of the Pivotal universe inside of VMware who are more on the salesy, complete other parts of the company that I happen to know through other relationships that are not expecting offers because they're expecting to be in that third group just because they know how Broadcom works and that's not going to happen.
Broadcom works, and if I may offer a little bit of a hack model of what they're doing here, my belief that people should leave comes from one of these assumptions, that if either of you knows anything that can offset that, then that'd be great. But I look at what Broadcom is doing. They tried to acquire Qualcomm and they couldn't. They're a fundamentally acquisition-based company, and they have eaten their way to the top of the hardware food chain. What they are acquiring with VMware is a digestion system for a new type of food. VMware can acquire software companies.
Interesting.
And so I would not expect the sales and support and so on positions to highly be retained, but I'd expect the engineering and management columns to be retained. I'd expect management to be flattened some because they gave us a whole brief on how one of their values, like a be kind level value for them, is flat organization. So I know, in fact, at least one manager I've talked to has received an offer that doesn't specify them as a manager under the new contract.
Interesting.
So I expect some things like that, but that's my model of what Broadcom's doing. They're trying to move into a new ecosystem niche where they can keep acquiring companies.
So I think there's a complementary thing here to that model, which is interesting. I hadn't quite thought of it that way, because they have bought some other software companies, but nothing. They haven't bought.
Yeah,
but
it didn't go
ish. But
yeah.
I'm also hearing that they know that didn't necessarily work as well as they wanted it to, and maybe trying something different. But they have a much higher, a lower tolerance for organizational inefficiency.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes from the hardware. That's much more of a hardware mindset than a software mindset, right? We in a software mindset, especially pivots, have an eventual consistency model, and a lot of software companies, and I think VMware is one of these companies where they will make a bet whether they're buying something or starting a new line of business. Sometimes that's the same thing, where they just will continue to invest in it because it isn't too big of a tax on the whole org and their finances, because they're still printing money because they haven't moved to a subscription model, and they're doing all that anyway. So I think the rumors that I've been hearing is that Broadcom sees a lot of fat in the VMware organization, both on the product side, and that gets into the flat organization, the flat hierarchy thing that you mentioned. But I think also they know that there are a lot of companies out there that can do a much better job at reselling VMware/Broadcom software products than VMware's own sales engine.
Yeah.
And I could rant for hours about the enterprise sales process and how freaking broken it is.
Right.
But if you accept that as part of the tax of doing business, you just keep throwing money at it. And I think VMware has certainly done that. Pivotal did that. I can't speak to VMware that much, but Pivotal was definitely doing that. Pivotal did not crack the enterprise sales nut. And Broadcom is probably going to say, well, we're not going to do it. We're going to let other people do it. And we're just going to take the money. So I think that those two things are complementary, I also would say that going back to the logistics thing, I'm still hearing from people who haven't heard, even though their names may have been mentioned in other people's letters. So someone I know had their manager mentioned, and that manager hasn't received a letter yet. So, and people within the same org that haven't received letters. Right. So I let's not subscribe to malice. What could be or business model, which could just be subscribed to logistics.
Right. Yeah. It's not even incompetence. It's extremely hard to do these things.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect there is some basic, why didn't you send an email to everyone explaining the parameters of communication stuff? And I suspect that that's because Broadcom did not appoint a director of communications about this acquisition, because they do not think about the employee experience in that way.
Probably not.
And I think that people should take some information from that, right? It was revealing how VMware conducted their acquisition, and it is being revealing how Broadcom is conducting this acquisition, both
Sure.
for ill and for positive.
Right.
Honestly, I will pull zero punches on VMware's deep institutional inefficiency. And I suspect that Broadcom will fix some things, right? So for people who are in a part of the organization that has largely stayed Pivotal inherited, this could be good or bad, because fixing things may be just a different category of disruption. But for people who have been VMwareized, right, where the organization has been digested some, I'd actually expect relationships with other things to stabilize into a higher functioning place under Broadcom's dead-eye shark values than it did under VMware's deeply confused values.
Right. Can I tell you two of my favorite stories from the EMC acquisition of labs?
I would love to hear those stories.
So the first one was the HR system that they had was something based on SAP. It wasn't actually SAP, but I knew they had SAP in the back end at EMC. And everybody at Pivotal Labs received their invitation email to go sign on to the system with passwords and usernames in the clear. And you can just imagine how many pivots kicked down Edward and Rob's doors that day. We said, "Now, what now? You want us to trust these people?" Right. So that was hilarious.
Right. How have you sold us to these jokers?
Right. That was a polite. Yeah. That's the TLDR of that. The second was there was a follow-on to that around the ADP system. Something happened with our first paychecks from ADP, and it was, I forget exactly what it was super busted. Something was super busted with the first paychecks, and we all knew we were able to diagnose what had happened immediately, just because we'd been doing this for a while, right?
Yeah. No, engineers are such horrible users.
We're the worst. We're absolutely the worst. So what happened was Edward had already gone to the bat for us about the whole passwords in the clear into health insurance, insurance information and stuff like that. It was just an awful potential leak vector. But the thing that after this ADP debacle, and it's unimportant what it was, Edward said, it turns out, I think, and I'm going to get this slightly wrong. You remember people used to install software on-prem? Remember how that used to happen? And that whole thing where instead of feature flags, because you had software installed on-prem, you'd have different versions of software in different data centers, right?
This is not used to. This is alive in the world.
I know it still
right
happens.
now.
That's part of the joke. Anyway, EMC had a forked version of ADP's payroll system running on EMC servers, and so the bug is one of those things where the bug had been fixed years prior.
Yeah.
And it was something about how they did the import that borked everything. And it's if they had upgraded their software, this thing that was a mix of data being wrong and potential security problems, et cetera. Anyway, those are my two. So I look at that, the EMC acquisition of Pivotal Labs was awkward. The VMware acquisition of Pivotal was differently awkward, and I think smoother in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think this Broadcom one seems to be, it's certainly very interesting. Like I said, from what I'm hearing from people, and I mentioned, earlier that Christina, my wife, is going to stay a Broadcom employee. She's not going to resign. She's going to take the stay offer because she's on a project that she's happy with. She's on a labs project with former Pivotal employees on the other side, and it works. Why move, right? And that's the context that makes sense for her and for us. It also means that I can take a little longer to figure out what the heck I'm doing next. But the world outside is not awful. It's hard to get a job, but there are a lot of pivots in a lot of places that are looking for pivots. And I think people shouldn't, and in all roles, people shouldn't fret about that. Did Kobe talk about his new thing at all yesterday when y'all talked to him? He's got a thing going with a couple other pivots, which I won't share, but I know that like pivots are getting together. There are 3 or 4. You want to go work at a labs like consultancy? There are a bunch of those. I've got those listed at the alumni codex for those folks that know where that URL is. If you're at pivotal.fun, there are myriad opportunities. And if the shark, you don't like the look of the shark, feel free. Like the world is okay.
Well, this is another really big point of mine. I think Pivotal, whether willfully or otherwise, indoctrinated a lot of us to not trust small companies or startups, to think of those as places where they don't have HR, they don't know what they're doing, the hours are long, the founders are crazy, stay somewhere sane, and they end up looking to medium or large size organizations as the employment opportunities. And I think that is where the craziness and the difficulty of the employment problem is currently concentrated. Any job that has an API that is listed via API anywhere on the internet is currently deluged with AI assistant based improved resumes. People are applying to 10 or 100 times as many jobs as they might have been able to with an apparently customized resume. And I don't think the hiring managers have figured this out yet, that the depth of the pool that they are seeing, they think is a real change in the quality of candidate they might be able to hire. And so they're holding off on offers. And like, I think we are in a weird moment for a lot of those large organizations.
There's a handful of job listings that I would say are B- fits for me that I haven't applied to. And something very consistent that I've noticed is that these jobs will be up for a long stretch of time. They will go down for a short period of time. And you can see the number on LinkedIn. You can see how many applications. 50, 150, 500. I saw one that had 1,200 applications. I'm like, I'm not applying to that job.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is you can apparently repost a job and that number resets and it gets the same ID at LinkedIn. So I've seen that where like a job that I looked at 2 weeks ago, still open, still recommended to me, suddenly has, 50 applicants instead of 350, right? So that's interesting. There's another one that I saw that's kind of funny, which is I have this tracker I built in Notion, and I moved something to close so that it got closed before I decided I did or didn't want to apply to it. But then I go back to LinkedIn and it gets recommended to me again. I'm like, wait, what? It said it was closed, no longer accepting applications. And I noticed the same job, same listing. Now they might be 2 different roles that are texted identically, but I think they're A/B testing posts somehow.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. Now, and I don't think LinkedIn is. I think the hiring company is. Yeah.
There's this whole legibility problem where there's all these tools. People are doing all kinds of things. They don't know each other's systems. They're not coordinating effectively. So like people are having experiences that don't line up with the general unemployment numbers for software engineers. People are having a hard time finding jobs. I will not try and paint this picture where it's like, oh, it's like it was a year ago or whatever, where the market was absolutely overheated.
Right.
And demand was crazy. But I will say the situation is different for jobs that are not posted via an API. Those people are not flooded. Now, those companies are very small. Those are the companies that Pivotal, I think, helped us inoculate ourselves against. And a lot of these companies have pivots working at them, or second-time founders that have no interest in, living the 21-year-old dropout code all night lifestyle. There are a lot of other ways of living and being, and other ways of finding employment that, if you're only looking at medium and large size organizations, you won't necessarily know. And again, the Pivotal Network has connection with these, and the sort of second degree out has connection to these things. And frankly, these are places that are more likely to be influenceable by a small number of pivots than any of these large organizations, even for leadership positions, are. Like, I imagine you could roll off a number of stories of not making it in terms of changing an organization, either personally or someone else. And I see a lot of pivots who are out at other organizations trying to create a pivotal experience for themselves, becoming very frustrated. But I see the people who are working at these little consultancies and these small companies being much happier with that. And I see pivots. I'm going to start this myself. Hopefully there is a wave of people with an interest in these sorts of things. But there are startup incubators, and we could have a X Pivot Y Combinator club and be seeking that type of startup ecosystem in a way that I think people might not have seriously considered, especially if that pivotal culture of being like, those are clients. Feel free to go and work at one of those if you want, but you will be back.
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting. I think, and maybe this is because I worked at labs in a stretch of time when most, where 80% of our customers were startups, and some of them repeat founders with us. Right. I don't quite have that sort of anti-startup bias, I think, or the coefficients are different, I think, in my brain. But I think what you're saying is totally valid, which is the network, what is it? A friend of mine used to say the front door is a brick wall, right?
Yeah.
And maybe what you're saying is the API submitted job postings are a brick wall in front of a fire maze in the middle of the fire swamp. Like, something
currently under attack in a domain where attack has suddenly gotten a lot stronger, and people have not caught up and adjusted their models.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that for sure. So yeah, the referrals are always the better way to go. The alumni Slack, if you're a pivot, great place for that. If you're not a pivot, if you get on LinkedIn Premium, there's a hiring in your network feature that got launched last year that is not awful. It is there's some false positives in it, in that a recruiter that posts a job, if that recruiter knows some recruiter that you interviewed with like 3 years ago, or before Pivotal or somewhere else, like it'll say, hey, this person is hiring in your network. This person is in your network, and the job might not be a fit. But it is nice in that it is a smaller list to go through. It is less volatile. I haven't found a hit there, but it's something that I would say there are many other features I would like LinkedIn to add to Premium, but that one that got added last year is actually not bad, and I think it's worth at least looking for in the free trial to see if it's useful for you. The RAND's leadership Slack, while not a pivotal organization in any way, shape, or form, but if you if you need me to find that link for you, Tony, I can find it. If you can get into the RAND's leadership Slack, which is not hard to get into, it is the largest free Slack out there. As I understand it, and Slack will not it drives enough Slack traffic and interesting, good exposure to Slack that they continue to keep it free, unlike Pivotal.fun, which is, however many of us are farting around and dad jokes as a service. But there's a jobs channel there and a job searching channel, and there's a lot of, I would say, value overlap, if not practice overlap. Not one-to-one certainly, but there's I've had some good discussions with people over there, and some good anti-discussions. So it's probably far afield from the Pivotal Diaspora, but I think it's an interesting place that if you're there or are curious to be there, there's some good job channels and discussions in there as well.
Yeah, and I'll also say the list of Pivotal descended consultancies and Pivotal adjacent consultancies is broader than you might think.
Right.
They're mostly fairly small organizations, but that can also be a good thing. And I know several people who have managed to do things like spend summers guiding in Alaska and then come back and get on a contract, because it doesn't necessarily have to be a full-time employment lifestyle.
Yeah.
So I just the point of this is to expose people to a lot of resources and to open their minds and be like, if you really thought about it, and if you had another pivot to sit down and think about, how long do you think it would take you to make an iOS app that returned any money at all? Because you could do that. Even if you don't know iOS development now, and even if you're not interested in now, that's the type of thing that becomes possible and your imagination can encompass once you take off the load of the current gig. And severance is severance is a bit of a runway. And I think a lot of people who are at VMware today from the Pivotal acquisition are there because they loathe the idea of the job search, and they loathe the idea of the interview and this strange presenting yourself and buying a copy of Cracking the Coding interview and trying to get good enough to pass the dev rank or whatever shit that people put up in front of interviews now.
Yep.
I've seen a bunch of people go to these consultancies where it's like, oh, you worked at Pivotal for a bunch of years? We'll put you on a client gig.
Yeah.
Like, we'll have a conversation with you, and then you have a job and you're working with people who understand you. That's not always the experience.
Right.
But that kind of thing is possible.
And I will add something to this. This is from my job hunt experience in 2021, that it took a very awkward interaction after an interview for a job that I did not continue. I did not make it past this gate. There are actually two of these. One of these where there was somebody that said, I think this is a totally valid question of like behavioral interview question. Tell me about a time that you fired somebody. And I had so buried that down and compressed that experience away that I told different stories, talked about rotating people to other teams, into other orgs. And they told me, well, that sounds like you just got rid of a problem. I'm like, no, I found a better fit for someone and they're actually way happier. And that org is getting great value out of them that I couldn't. So that's not a negative. I also remembered after I got off the call and I was mortified that I had actually had. I remembered the firing stories came back, like I totally put them away because they aren't happy experiences.
I can't remember things that hurt.
Right, exactly. So that was interesting. The other one that was the most interesting, and this is actually really useful advice for people who are pivots or are on XP teams. I was on a call where I said we entirely too much. We are so attuned.
That's how we talk.
That's how we talk. Shared code ownership, shared values, shared, like, how can we make this happen? We did this together. I had to go through, I could completely rewrite my resume.
Oh yeah.
Neutrally claiming success, right? So it looked like I did that, and I still feel icky about it, but it's going to get me to that next thing.
I was looking at one of my colleagues on the team I left at VMware, describing what he did at this job, and he's like, I reduced this build time by X amount and eliminated this many CVEs, and I'm like, oh, you did you? But of course he did.
Right.
Yes,
he did.
We did.
Right.
And it's hard to put it out there. And my initial reaction is exactly what people are afraid of. But I got over that in like 2 seconds,
right.
Man. You have to claim those
victories. If you paired on that, you did that, right? Elizabeth had to talk me into that, but those are two things that I would share with folks.
Let's do this. Actually, let's do a episode on strategies here, and maybe we can actually get some more pivots backstage. And
sure,
we can bring people on talking about concerns.
Yeah, sounds great.
Let's do a quick
happy
station
to
ID.
Do that.
Yeah. Really, this is meant to be as a service for the community. Like, if we got every single person a job, that would be phenomenal. So this is Radio Free XP. We're talking with Davis Frank. Davis, one of the other things that we can't leave without it is talking about your work organizing the community, right? You run the Codex. You have been an active participant in Pivotal.fun. And so tell us what you're doing there. Tell us what help you need. What are your helps, interestings, and questions there?
Right. So the Alumni Codex, and I assume you'll put the URL in the show notes, was going back to the free Slack discussion before. There's a perennial, it comes about once a quarter. Can we move to Discord so we have a perpetual archive of everything in this community? In general, people like Slack better than Discord. I guess maybe if you're over 32, you prefer Slack to Discord. And that's a dig at me as much as anybody else. There's only a 90-day archive limit on free Slacks. So nobody wants to pay for Slack because it's expensive. Totally agree with that. It turns out Slack search sucks. Discord search is not that much better. So had a lean experiment 2 years ago of putting up a Google site with a bunch of content, and I just started pulling stuff and people gave me things, and had anybody who asked, I would give them admin access to the site so that they could go add whatever. And that works okay, but Google Sites is limiting for all the reasons that we know Google Sites is limiting. And as the number of people coming into the Slack grew, and we started running, and I forget exactly what it was. We ran into some problems where Google Sites was starting to break. So I spent an afternoon and a half, maybe 2 afternoons, moving it over to Markdown in a GitHub repo. Actually made an account. There's an alumni codex account on GitHub that I have the password to. I did it all. Originally, I just said, hey, let's just let GitHub run to the Markdown. So that was experiment number 2. But thanks to PR's JT Archie, long-term labs pivot, and a boomerang pivot. I think he came back a couple of times.
Absolutely. Yeah, he did.
Did both
come back again, but there's nowhere to come back to.
There is that. Man, he's got some good interviewing stories. You should have him on just to talk about his interviewing stories. He moved it over to MakeDoc. He spent an afternoon of his own time, and I don't speak Python, and I don't know GitHub Actions that well, but he actually put it in now that after a PR merge, it just renders out the HTML. It's beautiful. The color is not pivot teal. We need to fix that. I would love a PR for that for somebody.
We have a pivotal theme for MK Docs that has appropriate licensing from the platform automation when we used it the first time.
So that sounds fantastic, Jesse. I look forward to that PR.
Yeah,
that would be great.
No, JT and I will do it.
Okay, fantastic. That was just, let's have an archive. And we do have a list of labs like consultancies up there, and I accepted a PR from Eric Hansen for his new gig with Eric Sackby. I put that in this morning. I merged that in today. So that was just a thing that I've just been pushing. I can't shut up, so I spend a lot of time in the Slack anyway, and I'm unemployed at the moment, so I spend too much time over there. But for me, that was wow, let's not just deal with Slack. We can solve this problem somewhere differently. And the fact that it survived 3 experiments and is still going, even though I didn't put Google Analytics on. I don't care. It's just there, man. It's in GitHub Pages. We're never going to have to pay for it. Let's just throw stuff in there. And the only thing that I ask is that if it has a logo from any of our former employees, that we should not be putting it up in. I don't want this thing to get shut down because of a copyright violation or some IP rights or something. I know Joe Moore has been, and I link over to it. There's the Tanzu Practices site. Joe, full credit to Joe, a longer tenured pivot than myself, got himself a job where he lobbied hard for into VMware management. That some of these things that we've talked about today, as well as a whole bunch of other things, including a lot of the practices that VMware would open source those things, and that I hope that Tanzu Practices site still continues, but I link over to that. I would rather something with a logo on it go through that process and wind up on the public internet versus in the codex. But please, if you've got anything to contribute there with design topics, engineering topics, product topics, links to cool agility things you've seen elsewhere, put it up there. I added something else today. A designer who worked with some New York pivots put up a cool what's it called? I just put it up today. I'm going to see if it's up here. Jess Eddy's, she's got put out a navigating ambiguity toolkit. That's a little $48 thing with a bunch of PDFs to read and tips and tricks. Oh my gosh, I wish I had that at Fountain. That would have been super helpful for me. So there's a lot of stuff out there that I would say is Pivotal-esque, even if the DNA isn't direct. And giving, as a community, I'm just trying to pull those into a place so that you've got a place to go, and eventually I'm sure we're going to need to add search to this thing to find the thing that I can't remember, because the internet's too big and we only care about a slice of it when it comes to these things. I've got some other community ideas that I need to vet with some folks, but want to definitely push that stuff. There's way more than we can do. I think the thing I'm convinced about, and it's a hypothesis I want to truly validate, is that the community is way bigger than we realize. It's not just pivotal.fun. It extends to a lot of our clients and customers of our labs consultancies and customers of our products. There's a lot more out there than we realize. And going back to what you said, Jesse, in orgs of all sizes. So
has a huge impact. I went to a PairConf and its predecessor conf and XP and just saw all these people who were doing XP, and Pivotal is in the backstories of a lot of these places, but it's not up front. But it's still whole orgs of people who are doing our thing,
right,
or parts of it,
right. And we need to unify ourselves a little bit more, which is one of the reasons I love this idea about this podcast. Honestly, is let's talk about these things more.
So we said we put the URL in the show notes, but it's pronounceable. It's alumni-codex.github.io.
Yep. I'm going to hold you to that PR. You and JT to get give it Pivotal on this site. We need it.
Someone get a tracker ID for that. Davis, I can't second this whole thing enough. The community is very strong. I had an experience here in Phoenix where a woman who was Pivotal trained at one of our clients just walked in, and I'm like, oh, hi. And we talked, and she's like full blown. She's been, she's given dozens of RPIs. She's been both a dev and a PM in our process. And she quit her job because she's like, I know it can be done better, and I just can't do it anymore, right? Like
there is a better way.
So I will say, I will. This is a thing that I think is super, super important, and I think occasionally, and I'm not going to put the two of you in this camp because I don't think any of us. I don't think I've had discussions at this level with either of you. At least certainly if we had, it's been a while. But it turns out the process, right? There's been this discussion about the Agile Manifesto versus Scrum Agile, or whatever the heck the industry actually thinks Agile is, right? We don't want to say.
Gotta let Agile go.
No, the name doesn't mean anything anymore. So screw it. We don't necessarily need a new name, right? Because let's not put the cart before the horse there. But the actual process is iterating to find the process.
Yeah.
Right. That's all this is. XP is that for development, and it's a good set of practices that you actually can do a pretty big, like it's not all wholesale, but a lot of it really helps to be together. And Kent will say that too. Balanced team is how you have XP teams and designers and product managers work well together. Lean startup is this for business models and trying to figure out what to build, or what to do, sometimes build. So, but the thing that I learned, and I definitely learned this at my last gig at Fountain, which is you cannot come in thinking that you're on a Pivotal RD or a Pivotal Labs project on day one.
Absolutely not.
What you are is you have, and oh, by the way, there's not one true process. If the true Pivotal process is iterate all the things, then you have to go in with your toolbox that has in it things like tester and development and pair programming and a facilitator's kit and all the stickies that you can fit in to fill in the rest of the spot and all the Sharpies. And realize that your job is to go in there and help find the problems and use the things from your toolkit to help solve them. And not every place is going to get everybody pairing all the time. Not every place is going to be writing tests all the time. But if you can find the things and fix the things and get people, hold teams accountable for getting better, you can start using some of the language that we all used every day in our soft pairing and our just stuff just naturally, right? Didn't even know what we were doing that was different than anywhere else, right? And I think it's really important not to go in and think that you can change. You can't change an org. One person can't change an org. You really do need a certain critical mass. Not enough places have that. There are plenty that do, but not enough of them do. So your job as a pivot is to go in there with that toolbox and ask how you can help, and hey, let's pair more often than not, as we've talked about this entire call, and then reach in, pull something out of that toolbox, pull out the Sharpies, pull out the Post-its, pull out, and I guess one more thing I will add is I'll add two things. I'll add two books. The First 90 Days, which is a great book about going into a new organization in management, or in direct or indirect, it turns out. I think that a lot of things apply there, and just like listening for a while. And it's got some framework stuff in there, then figuring out how to execute. That forces you into a framework that prevents you from trying to do everything on day one, which is good. And if you have not read Janice and Jason Fraser's book, Farther, Faster, it's on camera now, and Far Less Drama. What I love about this book, and Janice and Jason are pals, I don't get anything from mentioning the book. There we go.
Have copy to hold up. We're not using the video, but we have to do the ritual anyway. Come on, Tony.
Is your copy over there?
Yeah, checked out.
Okay, great. What I love about that book, and it was not what I was expecting going in, reading it, was how much, from a completely non-engineering perspective, but how much the first part of their book, which are things that we all understand, and again, have compressed away so we don't think about them anymore, about how you get to the point of using, like, what is the root justification for a lot of the techniques that we kind of use naturally. And I'm like, yeah, of course. Like, of course that's where they came from. But there were stories that I hadn't heard despite knowing them, 10 years or whatever that I know them at this point. Longer. I think I met Janice probably in 2008. So I think those two books are great books for as you're leaving, as you're getting further from the nest, if you will. Those are some great books to learn to figure out how you can adapt to the outside world, where a lot of the things that we all take for granted aren't there yet.
Right. And whether you go to one of these organizations that you maybe want to influence, or you're joining some people that are doing it already, you're going to really benefit from that toolkit rather than map, or like a set of practices is not something you can follow. It's something you have to apply,
right?
Or that you can apply. And then similarly, the way we worked at Pivotal is not the destination you're journeying to. It's the past that you are using to learn from, not where you're going. And if that whole way of looking at it and everything we've just been talking about is exciting, and you're like, oh man, I couldn't use a book like Faster, Further with Far Less Drama where I am at VMware or Broadcom. Or if you're thinking of staying and you're like, oh yeah, the first 90 days probably applies in an acquisition situation too.
Absolutely does.
Follow that excitement. That's the main message I want to get across to people, is this does not have to be a dread-based decision-making or a pros and cons-based sort of cold logic, follow the money type decision-making.
Right.
You can think about this conversation and think about conversations you'll have if you'll be staying, and decide whether you're going to follow something. And I think that excitement of being out here and being re-immersed in these tools and their application to new problems and domains, it might be a lot more invigorating to you than you expect if you give it a chance.
I like that. I like that idea a lot.
This is a perfect place to roll off, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
No, thank you.
Yeah. Well, for all those people who are behind the wall, as we like to think of it, best of luck as you're getting your offers. Join Pivotal.fun if you were a pivot before the acquisition.
The VMware acquisition.
Before you need to have had a Pivotal email address,
right.
Unfortunately.
Right. And thank you for the time. I love talking to pivots, and I will extend that if anybody wants to reach out on the Slack. I'm happy to talk anytime. And I think probably the unsung hero here, or the person who probably has the most thanks, is Christina, who doesn't have to listen to me all day, every day. She knows that I can talk to somebody else and that it's okay. So she thanks you too. If you want to wave, you get a hand wave from Christina.
Hi, Christina.
Anyway, thanks, gang. Happy to talk anytime. Just holler. Love to get back on and talk about more stuff.
Perfect. We'll do it, Davis.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Radio Free XP. If you're interested in helping with graphics, bumper music, or other aspects of production, or if you'd like to be on the show, please contact Jesse Alford or Tony Hansmann on the Pivotal Alum Slack. You can also reach us via email at jesse.alford@pm.me or precept@gmail.com, respectively.